You won't see this twist coming. Watch until the end to find out how the fate of the characters unfolds. When I first married Daniel, I thought I had won the kind of love that movies are made of. He was attentive, charming, and could make anyone laugh, even my stern father. His hands were warm when they held mine, and his eyes always found mine in a crowded room. But love, I would learn, is not defined by grand entrances. It's tested in the quiet, ordinary moments, the moments no one ever talks about. It had been 2 years since our wedding, and we were already slipping. At first, I blamed the stress. New jobs, a new apartment, and the looming pressure to start a family. We had enough reasons to feel overwhelmed. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Daniel wasn't cruel, just distant, emotionally unavailable. He rarely asked how my day was. Conversations became brief exchanges of necessities: groceries, bills, errands. One evening, I stood at the kitchen sink, hands in soapy water, watching him through the open doorway. He was on the couch, staring at his phone, barely reacting when I spoke. "Did you hear what I said?" I asked, raising my voice slightly. He glanced up for a second and nodded. "Yeah, sounds good." But I hadn't even asked a question. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, his back turned to me, I stared at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time he touched me without being prompted, the last time he looked at me like I mattered. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was pretending it wasn't there. Pretending to laugh with friends, to smile at his parents during dinners, to keep up appearances. It was during one of those obligatory family gatherings that I first noticed something different. Daniel's father, Richard, had always been kind to me, a reserved man in his 60s with silver in his hair and a calm presence that made everyone feel safe. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He was the kind of man who always opened the door for others, who remembered your favorite tea, and who asked questions not to make small talk, but because he genuinely wanted to know. That Sunday, as I helped clear the table, Richard joined me in the kitchen. I hadn't realized I was sighing until he spoke. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. I turned to him, surprised. "Yes, of course. Just tired." His eyes lingered on mine a moment too long for a casual answer. He didn't press me, but he didn't believe me either. I could see it in the way he tilted his head slightly, like he was searching for what I wasn't saying. After dinner, when Daniel and his mother were arguing over what movie to watch, Richard came to sit beside me on the porch. The night air was cool and the garden lights made the yard glow softly. "You know," he said, sipping his tea, "sometimes people grow apart not because they stop loving each other, but because they stop listening." I nodded, unsure of what to say. His words hit too close to home. "I'm not trying to meddle," he added, "but I know what it looks like when someone is carrying too much alone." I turned my face away, embarrassed at how quickly my eyes filled with tears. I blinked them back, hoping he wouldn't notice, but he did, and he didn't say anything more. He just stayed there, beside me, silent and present. That night, back in our apartment, I stared at Daniel, who had already fallen asleep with the TV still on. I thought about Richard's words, and I realized that in that small moment on the porch, I had felt more seen than I had in months. Before you continue, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. I've got another compelling story coming tomorrow that you definitely don't want to miss. This one's just the beginning. Stay tuned for more twists and turns, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when the next chapter is up. Thanks for being part of this journey. The weeks that followed were like walking a tightrope, pretending nothing was wrong while everything inside me quietly unraveled. Daniel was home less and less. He said it was work. I believed him at first. Or maybe I just needed to. It was easier than facing the idea that maybe I was no longer what he wanted to come home to. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself back at his parents' house. Daniel had promised to join me later, but as usual, he was late, if he was coming at all. Richard greeted me at the door with a warm smile and an umbrella in hand. It had started to rain while I was parking. "You always forget your umbrella," he teased gently, holding it over us as we walked to the porch. "It's not forgetting," I said, brushing rain from my sleeves. "It's hopeful optimism." He chuckled, then offered me a towel once inside. As the hours passed and Daniel didn't show, His mother kept checking the clock. But Richard never asked where his son was. Instead, he made sure my tea stayed warm and my hands didn't feel empty. We ended up in the garden, under the covered patio, watching the rain fall. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. "He's not coming, is he?" I asked without looking at him. "I don't know," Richard said honestly, "but I'm glad you did." I looked up, surprised by how soft his voice sounded, like he meant more than he was saying. "I feel invisible," I admitted. "And it's terrifying how easy it's become to hide it." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded note, the kind of paper that had been creased and uncreased many times. "I wrote this for my wife," he said, "years ago, when I thought she might be slipping away from me." I took the note carefully. It was just a few lines, simple and unpolished, but every word hit something deep in me. "If I've stopped looking at you the way I used to, it's because I forgot how lucky I am. And if I ever forget again, I hope this reminds me. I see you. I always will." I closed my eyes, pressing the note against my chest. No one had said anything like that to me in a long time. Later that night, when I finally got home, Daniel was already asleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching him breathe. I tried to remember the last time he'd noticed anything about me. My haircut, the way I cried in the shower, how I stayed late at his parents' house just to feel heard. There was nothing between us anymore except shared bills and forgotten promises. I kept Richard's note in my nightstand, and I read it every time I needed to remember what it felt like to matter. By the middle of that month, Daniel had all but vanished into his own world. He came home late, left early, and when we did sit across from each other at the dinner table, it felt like I was staring at a stranger wearing my husband's face. I stopped asking where he had been. I stopped reminding him of things he used to care about. I even stopped hoping he'd notice that I wasn't okay. Instead, I started noticing other things, like the way Richard always remembered how I took my tea, the way he paused mid-conversation to make sure I felt heard, the way his eyes held mine, not out of desire, but out of genuine attention. One evening, I stopped by their house to drop off some documents Daniel had left behind. Richard was alone in the kitchen, slicing apples with an old knife and humming softly to himself. He looked up, surprised to see me. "You're just in time," he said. I was making a pie. It sounded simple, but that moment would stay with me longer than I expected, because no one had made anything for me in what felt like years. "I won't stay long," I said, placing the folder on the counter. "You can stay as long as you like," he replied gently. I stayed. We didn't talk about Daniel. We didn't need to. Richard seemed to sense the heaviness in me without prodding, and instead, we spoke about books, music, the weather, the kinds of conversations that feel safe, but still let the soul breathe. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even close to inappropriate, but it was something I had been starving for: connection, warmth, presence. I helped him with the pie, laughing when the flour ended up on my nose. At one point, he brushed it off with the pad of his thumb, and I froze. Not because it was intimate, but because it was kind. That night, as I sat in my car outside our house, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked different, not because of Richard, but because I had started to remember who I was before all of this. Inside the house, Daniel was scrolling on his phone in bed. He barely looked up when I came in. "You ate?" he asked absently. "Yes," I said, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I lay beside him in the dark, both of us facing opposite directions, and in that thick silence I realized I was lonelier with him than I had ever been without him. The next day, I found a note tucked into the pie tin Richard had sent home with me. "Sometimes people drift not because they stop loving each other, but because they stop seeing what's still there. I hope you find someone who never stops looking." I read it 3 times, and then I cried for all the things I had buried, not because I wanted someone else, but because I knew I couldn't survive in the shadow of someone who no longer saw me. I'll take a short pause. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever gone through something similar. I'd love to read your stories, and if you'd like to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. I'm continuing now. The days that followed were like walking through a fog. I went through the motions, work, meals, house chores, but none of it felt real. My body was present, but my heart had retreated somewhere deeper, quieter, somewhere even I couldn't reach. Daniel noticed none of it. He was more distant than ever, and I stopped asking why. I already knew the answer. Late one afternoon, I returned home early from work. My head was aching, my chest heavier than usual. I just wanted to lay down for a while. As I stepped inside, I heard muffled voices coming from upstairs. Laughter, a woman's, and Daniel's. Something sank in my stomach. I didn't rush. I didn't scream. I just stood there listening until the voices faded and footsteps moved away from the hallway. When I finally walked upstairs, the guest bathroom door was closed. The air smelled faintly of perfume, something sweet. Not mine. I didn't confront him. I didn't even knock. I just walked into our bedroom, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed in silence. That night, Daniel didn't say a word to me. I think he assumed I hadn't noticed, and maybe that was worse than the betrayal itself, because it meant he didn't even care if I did. The following weekend, Richard invited me for coffee. I hadn't told him anything, but he must have seen something on my face the last time we met, some trace of sorrow I couldn't hide. We sat on his porch in the late afternoon light, the air thick with the scent of rain on dry earth. "You don't look okay," he said. I smiled bitterly. "I'm not." His silence was steady, patient. Then I said something I hadn't said to anyone else. "He's seeing someone else." Richard's jaw tensed, but he didn't interrupt. "I don't know who she is, but I heard them upstairs, laughing, the kind of laughter I haven't heard from him in years." He leaned forward, his voice calm and even. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. I just keep thinking, what did I do wrong? "You didn't," he said immediately. "Don't carry what isn't yours." Those 5 words wrapped around my bruised heart and held it still. Don't carry what isn't yours. I realized then how long I had been blaming myself for Daniel's distance, how often I had folded myself inwards, trying to be easier to love, quieter to keep, smaller to hold on to, and I was done. The turning point came one evening when Daniel walked in, tossed his keys on the counter and asked, "Why are you always in such a mood lately?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just said, "Do you love me, Daniel?" He looked startled, then shrugged. "I don't know." I nodded. "Then I'll stop asking you to try." He stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. But I wasn't speaking to him anymore. I was speaking to myself, and to the woman I had left behind in the quiet war of our marriage. After that night, something shifted inside me. I didn't pack my bags or storm out in anger. I simply began reclaiming pieces of myself, quietly, gently, without permission. Daniel hardly noticed. He was too caught up in whatever fantasy he had created outside our home. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't care that I stopped waiting up for him, that I smiled more often, but never at him. I started visiting Richard more often, not to cry, not to complain, but because it was the only place I could breathe without holding my chest. He never crossed any lines. He made me tea. He let me talk. He told me stories of his youth and listened when I didn't feel like telling mine. His presence was calm, steady, comforting in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. One day I told him about the night Daniel shrugged and said he didn't know if he loved me. Richard looked at me for a long moment, then said, "When someone doesn't recognize your worth, it says nothing about your value, only about their blindness." I think I fell in love with that sentence before I ever admitted I had fallen for the man who said it. But I didn't act on it. I wasn't ready. Not yet. The end came not with a fight, but with silence. Daniel came home late again, the smell of someone else's perfume clinging to his jacket. I didn't ask who it was. He didn't offer. I left my wedding ring on the dresser the next morning. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. That was answer enough. When I moved out, Richard helped me carry the last of my boxes. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Before he left, he stood by the door and said quietly, You have more strength than most people ever find. I hope you see that now. I did, for the first time in a long time, I did. Months passed. I found a small apartment. Nothing grand, but it was mine. I filled it with quiet music, fresh flowers, and books I had forgotten I loved. I learned how to live alone again, how to cook for one without sadness, how to fall asleep without waiting for a door to open. One evening, there was a knock at my door. Richard. He was holding a small plant in one hand and a shy smile in the other. I thought your windowsill looked a little empty, he said. I laughed and let him in. We drank tea. We talked about nothing. And then when the room fell quiet, he looked at me, not like Daniel ever did, but like I was someone who mattered, someone who was seen. I never wanted to complicate your life, he said, but I need you to know what your husband failed to cherish, the world doesn't deserve to lose. My throat tightened. I don't need fixing, I whispered. I know, he said. I just want to remind you of the light you already have. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Love doesn't always come in grand gestures or stolen nights. Sometimes it waits, it listens, it holds space. And sometimes it comes from the most unexpected place, even from a man who once held the title of father-in-law, but who turned out to be the one who saw me all along.